All right. In 1 Corinthians, of course, we divided it, the first part, into two distinct kind of problems. The first section covers the first 6 chapters, of which we are nearing the end. The two problems are the problem of division that's covered in the first 4 chapters, and that is resolved by turning to what God has said and to honor Him with those things instead of going out on our own or dividing up into camps based upon people. And then we saw, beginning in chapter 5, that the second problem they had was a moral problem. So we have a doctrinal problem, we have a moral problem, and this was the man who had taken his father's wife. We saw in chapter 5 how to handle that problem was through church discipline, because nothing else had worked. They hadn't gotten through to that, and this needed to be taken care of. That they didn't then need to go outside or go to the world for the solution, as it appears that the father had done, verses 1 through 8. And then he deals with, in verses 9 through 11, which was the last thing we studied, as just addressing the seriousness of the problem through this exhortation. That this, you need to understand that we're talking about the difference between eternity in heaven and eternity in hell here. That's what kind of matter fornication, sexual immorality is. He needed to establish that so that what we have happening now, if we've got the fact that they handle it the wrong way, here's how to handle it the right way, and so now we need to understand you can't dismiss it. Now what we're getting to is addressing the arguments behind justifying it. And he's going to use those, and then he's going to close this off. And the only thing I'm going to tell you, and this is just a preview, I think, of coming attractions, but it's kind of like one of those things that you see in the movies that says coming this fall. Well, that's kind of what this is. But what we're going to see is the structure in which he presents this in this section that we're in now, that we just began really with verse 9 through 11 as one main section about the exhortation. He then, I would argue, mimics for his conclusion in verses 18 through 20. That is, you have exhortation, you have explanation, you have rhetorical device, and then you're going to bring it all home. And we'll go into more detail when we get there on how that structure works. But now, as we come to verse 12, we're seeing what it sounds like it's straightforward. It is not. I want to read it, and then we want to have that discussion. Okay. All things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a very straightforward passage about what we would call expedience. That, okay, you have everything is allowed, okay, all these things are allowed, but that doesn't mean it's the thing to do. Now, I'm going to tell you that part of the problem here is in translation, that the words that are used here are, let's say, for example, all things are lawful. The idea of law is nowhere in that word, not inherently. It is instead the idea of technically things, all things to me are out. Yeah, if you have a funny look on your face, that's what I was thinking when I ran across it trying to translate it. Okay, and then all things are, in our text, not helpful. I think profitable would be better here. And then you come down in the next thing when it says what all things then is, again, the same repetition, all things to me are out. They're out there. But I will not be brought, it says, under the power of any. That is a word that is more related to authority. Okay, and it's very difficult. I will not be placed under authority by it. That's the wording. And we lose a little bit in the translation by something like that. Right. Now, so first of all, let's just think about this as it's written, and then I want to try to show you what I think is going on. All things are lawful, okay? Now, I think it's better probably with this translation, the best way to look at this, all things are allowed. Now, either way, is that a true statement? As just straight, universal, is that a true statement? No, no, that's not. That itself is not a true statement. And the way in which I translate it, and it is difficult, is all options are allowed to be, or we would say, maybe colloquially, all options are on the table. That is, okay, no, we're getting somewhere with this of understanding. It's talking about what's possible for us to choose to do. That doesn't mean it's the good thing to do. Okay, now the question now is whether or not, so this is really kind of ought to be in quotes. When it says all things are lawful for me, that kind of ought to be in quotes. The question is Paul quoting someone that in Corinth, or is he anticipating an argument like this? Now, I'm going to give you a little more background to hopefully make this more sense. There was actually a philosophy that would somewhat address this, and that is cynicism. Not cynicism in the sense where you hear it today, but more ancient cynicism, which is kind of on the thing of is that, well, if it's possible, you can do it. Okay, that's, it's kind of what, if you've studied it all within the realm of ethics, it commits what's the is-ought fallacy. That because it is, that means it ought to be. In ethics, because you can do something, that means that, well, it's a good thing to do. So you can think about all different things that have happened in the last 100 years medically. Just because something can be done doesn't mean it ought to be done. Right? These are things that are in the news today. Just because something can be done doesn't mean it ought to be. Those are two different things. Okay, so you look at this in terms of, from a cynicism, it was more of an idea of, well, you know, it's just out there. It's possible. And so who's to say? That was kind of the attitude. And so it's very possible that that idea is what Paul is capturing here. Because he keeps doing it. He does it twice. All options are allowed to me, or all things are lawful to me. Then he contrasts it. But all things are not helpful. So it sounds like there's almost a contradiction. If he's saying the two things by himself back to back, you think, well, what's the point? But if he's presenting this idea, but wait a minute, you haven't considered this, now he's making an argument. We tend to think of everything that's being said as just being straightforward. We call it didactic, just giving facts. But he's making an argument instead. All things are lawful to me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. What he's really done in addressing that idea by repeating it twice, it's what follows that's his argument. There are two principles that he's saying they had forgotten in terms of making their determination. Now remember, the context of this problem is a man has taken his father's wife. What, you can do it, why not? And, well, there's a number of reasons why not. He had just stated that in verses 9 through 11. The first reason is you go to hell for things like that. That's the first argument, okay, in verses 9 through 11. You won't have eternal life. But then he's going to make this go in detail to the argumentation itself in saying just because something is possible does not mean it's the thing to do. You need instead is, where is the profit in it? Where is the value in it to participate in those kind of things? So he's talking about it, looking at it more of an expedient. That truly is. How is that helpful, expedient, profitable? In the context of a moral way. And he's doing a little bit of philosophy here. So then he comes back and says, all things are lawful for me. Okay, but what about this? I will not be brought under the power of any. And this is that word, that big word, it's a really long word about letting something you're being controlled. By idea of authority, that something is controlled, that you're letting it lead. Now, essentially, if you put that in this context then, okay, it's going to start making sense. Just because it is possible to hook up with just anybody doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. just because God made you with the body that does have desires does not mean you want to let those desires determine what you do. See, what they had done was the arguments were essentially animalistic. If you think about how an animal doesn't make a moral decision when it goes somewhere, right? It's just looking around. It's not needing to make a moral decision. That's none of those, And you all like Planet Earth or those things. You just look out and you're watching you don't sit down. One of my favorite things is that joke of where I'm not going to tell it, but the whole idea of the bear that he's when the guy says, please God, make this a Christian bear, and the bear stops and prays before he eats him. Is that they're not making some kind of moral decision when they decide whether or not to maul you. They're not making a moral decision or working through that over whether or not this is the bear I'm going to mate with. Right? That has nothing to do with it. Okay? And that's part of the problem, because that's the problem he's dealing with in the context of where they had come. Of going ahead and taking something that should be moral and eliminating the spiritual aspect of it and just having a philosophy that's based upon, if it feels good, do it. Though I'm sure that's very far afield from anywhere we could get in America in the 21st century. Yeah. So this idea is not that far removed philosophically. We just kind of pretty up and retell the story. So to show you what he's doing, and he's making an argument now he's doing the similar thing when you get down to verse 13. Because that otherwise, if we don't recognize and see the argument he's making, verse 13 sounds very strange. Okay? What is he? He says, foods for the stomach and the stomach for foods, but God will destroy both it and them. What? Well, if we clean it up a little bit and simplify it, food is for the stomach. And the stomach is for solid foods. That is, there's a relationship between them. They exist, right? That is, that they just exist to go together. It's a natural thing. It's nature. There's food, there's a stomach, you eat. That's great. But notice that Paul's doing a similar thing in that he has a contrasting clause. He says, but God will destroy both it and them. You're forgetting something about the nature of the food in the stomach, is that these are not permanent. This is limited. It's just now. He's going somewhere really important with all this. It's just physical. And again, this is his whole point of the argument that they have fallen prey to, was thinking of yourself solely as a physical being, following physical rules, and therefore acting based upon what your body would tell you to do in any given moment, and just reacting to that. I'm hungry, eat. Right? I'd be better off if I'd stopped there, right? My problem is eating when I'm not hungry. That's the problem I have, right? So you get worse. But that's the whole idea here is what's going on. But he says there's a problem. God will destroy both it and it's going away. That's going to cease to, actually the word destroy is render idle. Okay, that's going to be totally irrelevant. But now look at the next statement. So you have to understand how these work together to see that they are paralleled for the argumentation. Because he says, now the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. And the Lord for the body. And God both raised up the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Now, here's where we find he is taking the parallel and showing they're not parallel. That's the nature of this argumentation. He lays it out about the argument that's being made. Hey, look, just food, right? But that's not what he's really talking about. He's dealing with the problem of sexual immorality. It's just body, it's just physical. Don't know what your problem is here. But he says it has to do with purpose. Their argument of laying that together was it's just like food. Food's for the stomach, stomach for food. They're made to go together, and, eat a meal, you're done with it. Move on. Next meal. And that was the attitude toward sexuality. So he brings this back up to show these are not the same. Did God make food for the stomach? Yes. Its purpose was to fulfill that, provide digestion and provide nutrients? Yes. Did God give you a body so you could run around and be sexually promiscuous? No. So he's dealing with a purpose statement here in contrasting them. Is that comparison, that analogy, here's a good example of why analogies don't prove anything. That analogy just doesn't work because they're not parallel. So he says it doesn't exist for that reason. Okay? Instead, the body is for the Lord. So the problem you have in that argument is in thinking that just this body was made to do whatever with it. No, you were given a body to do what God says. There's a reason why he chooses Lord here. What does the name, and it's more than a name, Lord, though, have it as its connotation? What goes with it? Jesus means Savior. Christ means anointed one and king and one who fulfilled the promises. But what does Lord mean? Master and authority. Your body's made for the Lord, which means your body exists to do what the Lord tells you to do. Not whatever you feel like doing. You are given a body for the Lord's benefit. Not for you to do just whatever. So he says, that's a big difference. And when he does this, and then he says, and the Lord for the body exists. So that means that what he is and what he did to become your Lord is for the benefit of your body too. Go ahead, Sandra. Mm-hmm.
And the Lord is for the body, so the master is for the body.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. That is actually the whole idea of the authority fact originally, which is captured in master. Is the Lord's the one that's supposed to have lordship, not just whatever. And so, under their philosophy and their ethics, if you will, they were basically letting the body and how it felt, what it wanted, rule them. When in reality, he's saying your body was made for the Lord to rule. He's your master. But then he's going to follow that up with something else that is in parallel with what he just said about the nature of the foods. Remember what he had just said about the foods was, but God will destroy both it and then or render it idle. Notice the statement that is added for the body. And God both raised up the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. So now he's tying us together. It actually works very well with Eddie's lesson this morning, 9 o'clock. The nature of what he has just said is God raised up the Lord, okay? Our Lord, that we're to listen to, and will also raise us up. What is the contrast? He's going to do that by his power. Okay. Now, that's also interesting because of the wording of what it takes to raise someone from the dead. These are not going to have any focus. They're going to be completely irrelevant. They're not made to basically be beyond this life. You are. And the fact that he raised the Lord up, Jesus, proves that. Now, think about what he is anticipating here. He's anticipating what he's covering in chapter 15 later on about the resurrection. So, clearly that idea of being an animalistic kind of existence that only is for the now was a problem in Corinth. He's addressing it on the problem end here and the moral end, but he's going to address it on the doctrinal end at the end of the book by dealing with the fact that you are eternal. He bleeds in verses 9 through 11. It's one of the reasons why he's talking about in those verses the whole idea about inheriting the kingdom of God, about looking beyond and seeing yourself as having an existence beyond this existence, and that's relevant for the choices you're making now. So now what do we have here? He has the Lord. He's raised up the Lord. He's going to raise you up. You have purpose and identity and existence. This is body. Now it's going to be a changed body. That's what he's going to get to in 1 Corinthians 15. But still, the idea of body, which is essentially a container. You realize you got a spirit and a container, right? And soul is tying them all together. That's what we got. The container, we're going to get a better container one day. Okay? So, for some of us, that's really a great thing, right? So, you say, that's right. And your spirit you take with you into eternity. That's why you better make sure that's a great thing. So he has put these things together about the nature of the food and paralleled it to say, you're comparing things that are completely dissimilar. You know, you're comparing apples and a hibachi grill. They don't go together. Nothing in common whatsoever. So here's what we have of so greatness you need to keep in mind, and that is to inform your decisions, going back to verse 12, is not what are my options, but I'm supposed to be thinking about what does the Lord want me to do and what best fulfills my purpose in this body for him. And then the second part, to make sure that I'm not allowing anything to tell me, any part of me or anybody else to tell me what to do, because I've already got a Lord for that. And that ought to be what is informing me on all these things. All right. So that's the first part of this argument. Now, so we have exhortation 9 through 11, and we've had questions with contrast. With statements of quotations with contrast that are basically verses 12 through 14. Now we get to rhetorical questions that he's going to use in part of his argumentation. Beginning of verse 15. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Now what happens the rest of this chapter, we tend to jump there and forget this context, that all of this is tied together. Do you not know that your bodies, okay, he is emphasizing bodies for a member. He didn't say you are members of Christ. Your bodies are members of Christ. Why does he word it that way? Because they had made this distinction, essentially, that the idea of the body was something that would just be cast off and was actually in irrelevant to anything else that was going on in their lives spiritually. It's almost an anticipation of Gnosticism, not quite. But it's that kind of idea of where he's going with this, if you remember when we were talking about that in 1 John. So he comes out of this and says, okay, your bodies are members of Christ. You belong together. Now he's changed to Christ. That's relationship. That's your king. That's the anointed one. That's the one who is a human, came down also, but to reign and to fulfill everything that God said for him to do, which is important in this context of what we ought to do. So if that is true, that he started with the argument of the rhetorical question, okay, let's follow that up with another question. Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? Okay, now notice how the argument is rolling, what he has done. He had to first establish that this is a serious eternal problem. Then he needs to establish that that problem extends to the body itself. Okay, that's part of the issue, because you are made to ultimately to be eternal. Changed body, but still the framework is still there. Okay. And now he's moving that along and saying, okay, with all these things in mind then, it's about eternity, it's about where you're going to spend eternity. The body is going with you, it's tied in, so what you do with the body matters. Okay? It's not just going to be cast aside like food. It's tied in with your spirit. So what do you do with that body? Because you are all interconnected in this way, what you do with that body says something and affects everything else. So, shall I then take the members of Christ? Okay, that's who we are. Okay, we're Christians. We've chosen this. We belong to Him, anticipating eternity, and make them members of a harlot. Now, the word here, harlot, prostitute, is the word porne, which is related to the word fornication, which he's been dealing with throughout. That's why it's relevant. He hasn't jumped ship here and going somewhere else with it. He's dealing here with the questions of sexual immorality. Is someone characterized by that, by choosing to be part of this, and that what you're doing with your body in that process is tying you together. Okay, now he's going to build on this argumentation. So the fact that he's saying this rhetorically, he's going to add in, says, certainly not. May it never become so. Don't think it for a minute that would be okay. So now he follows that. Or, do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her? Just notice. He's getting there gradually on this argument. One body with her. Say, well, that's not right. That's not what's happening. Oh, it's not, is it? Let me remind you of something. Okay? Have you thought about this? And now he's going to show why that's the case. For the two, he says, shall become one flesh. Where is that found? That's another quotation, but a different type of quotation. Genesis 2. That's Genesis 2 and how he's describing Adam and Eve. Okay? So, he's going, and this is quoted, that's one of the passages that's quoted many times for different purposes. Jesus quotes it in Matthew 19. Paul quotes it in Ephesians 5. Here it's quoted differently. It's actually really important because each time there's a little bit different angle to the oneness that's brought up. Here, for Paul's argument, he is showing that part of the oneness of marriage is physical oneness. And in doing so, that aspect of that union, that is a physical union of bodies, that's be one body. Well, guess what happens when that's outside of marriage? One body. Okay, so he's just gotten down to the part of the problem here. He's making an argument that you're trying to, he's saying this to them essentially. You're trying to argue that what is going on in your body is totally separate from having any effect on you practically, spiritually. That was essentially the idea. He's just now put this together by tying it to Christ, and because you are tied to Christ, you're members of Christ, and now what he's saying is, look what you're dragging Christ into. If you're members of Christ, that was a previous commitment. He starts with this idea of you're members of Christ to show that commitment in being Christians. And now, that being made, now you're dragging him into this fornication. And that's going to happen because of the nature of physical oneness as God designed it, which was designed to be limited to within marriage. But then verse 17. But he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. How is he tying this? He already started, and this shows the nature of why it's a little paragraph here. Your members, he starts with, your bodies are members of Christ. And then he ends by saying that he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. Now, you ought to have captured something a little bit, should have recognized that word joined. Joined to a harlot is one body, and then he says joined to the Lord. So parallelism, right? Difference is how you're joined in this sense. You're joined to the Lord, Spirit. What's inside? Container, external, internal. They're related to one another. It has to do with, though, whether or not you're listening to the Lord, with whom you are joined in spirit through your obedience, that you're accepting what he says to do with the container. You're one spirit. Unity. Now, this is what I'm trying to, the whole thing centers around unity and making a choice about unity, and that there are things that are at odds with one another. John? They have been Christians for a while. We think probably 4 to 5 years. Have they heard this before? We don't know. Certainly, they were told about the problems of fornication, because that's why in verses 9 through 11 he could say, such were some of you. So we know he had to have told them they had to leave those things. So the question then would be whether or not in the intervening time, had they had additional instruction from the Spirit on that, though as we're going to get to later in chapters 12 and 14, they're going to be, that still is dependent upon whether or not they are listening to what the Spirit is saying and letting him speak in those instances. But we'll cover that, I don't know, a couple of years. Yes. Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. All you have here, in a way, he's presenting it one way, is the tug between the world and Christ. But it's being presented in this fashion. You say, well, why didn't he just say that? Because we're not in Corinth in the first century. They are. And this was what was the language of the day, and their particular problem was this underlying kind of philosophy that was part of it. But once we get it out there, we can see these ideas are still there. They're in our society too. Okay? I mean, I've seen all sorts of ideas about, well, it's natural. You know how much pornography has been justified on the basis of, well, the body is just natural and beautiful. It's the same argument. That is the same argument here. It was made that way. Yeah, it was, and then they decided to have something in the tree, and then God put clothes on them and said, don't do that. Okay? Things have changed. So when he's putting this whole thing together of seeing the conflict now, he's trying to get us to see and operate based upon the conflict of don't be falling prey to these kind of arguments of the world's making. Okay? Don't fall prey to that. And just instead remember who's really supposed to be in charge. Okay? Now, yes, sorry, Ron.
That's perfect, because that's where I was going. Perfect.
Let's know about the word rejoined. It is exactly the same word. It's intentionally the same word. And the nature of that word is, see if you capture this, to be glued together. Which is, where is he borrowing that word from? In Genesis 2, in this quote, he just has a partial quotation, the two shall become one, right? But if we read the whole of it, and even though this is Hebrew, the meaning of the words are pretty close. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The King James says, cleave. It's this word in the Septuagint. You're glued to. And that actually shows the nature of the problem too, is that they were treating essentially human bodies and in that way a sexual relationship as instead this is something where you stick with someone for life item. And now, by having that the same thing, you are to be joined, right, to the Lord in spirit. That's how we are. What is that supposed to be? Is it supposed to be something that is cast out at your convenience, or you stick to for life? Now he is specifying it with spirit, but the parallel there is, I think, directly intentional, because it's going back to the wording. He's making an allusion to that earlier word they would have recognized in Genesis. Even though these were a lot of Gentiles, by this time they should have had enough background to have recognized that reference. And the idea of, and this is the harder thing to think about, we can understand joined with one flesh. That's a very straightforward concept. Physical act. And why in fornication that's wrong. Joined in one spirit, that's a little tougher for us to see though, isn't it? And it reveals something that is a particular problem for us. And I don't mean that in that we're somehow at fault, I'm just saying it's difficult. Is that when you cannot think of joining Christ in spirit in a physical way. That doesn't mean that there are not things that he expects you to do. You are in a body, that's kind of the point. You're a spirit with a body, I like to say. You're not a body with a spirit, but a spirit with a body. And you use this to express, and really what it is, you're expressing through your body what your spirit is all about. They were wanting to disconnect. He's saying, in making those connections, you're choosing, because this is contrary to the will of God, this is what's being expressed. is they were making a priority of the body and physical union over the spirit and spiritual union, when those are supposed to align. That was the core problem of trying to basically live in two different worlds. We do it with time. You know, it's the whole idea of the person who wants to party on Saturday night, come and worship on Sunday morning. Do it in time. But it's still, it's something I want to do because I want to do it. It's the pull of the world, the body fulfilling this, and just lust at work. And then I'm going to turn on the love God switch on Sunday morning and get up, and everything's going to be good because that's about my spirit. He's saying these are connected. And that what the key is, if you go back to what Jesus said, if you remember, in the garden, he's praying. He's already been up all night. They've been up. He's praying and just under immense stress. The apostles fall asleep. And he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Okay? And I would argue that essentially the nature of Christianity is to be strengthening the spirit to the point of where it is stronger than the flesh. And that is the point of all. So that where the will is tied to Christ and His will, what He wants done as our master, is for the Spirit to exert itself on this body and determine what the body should do, instead of allowing the fleshly nature of this body to then be giving directions back to the Spirit. That is the problem that he's addressing here. That's the core problem of fornication. It's the core problem, though, of a whole lot of this. Okay? Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that was the bell. We've got 3 verses to go. Have a good time with Willie for 8 weeks. I'm going to be traveling a lot here next 2 months. So hold that thought.